This is CSX Railroad? Yes. Hey, we just got a report that we have a train stopped over near Central Parkway, right in between there across the Blanchard River. Okay. We got a report that we have a train stop right now because they see a naked female body laying in the middle of the track. Appears to be deceased.
This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen. The case we're going to cover today is the murder of Vera Jo Reigel. On March 26, 2011, around 2 a.m., Vera was found naked and covered in stab wounds on a set of railroad tracks near the Blanchard River in Findlay, Ohio.
Findlay, Ohio is in Hancock County and is the second largest city in northwest Ohio. It's located about 40 miles south of Toledo. The population is around 41,000 people. About 6% of the people that live there are below the poverty line. It is also known for being the home of NFL's Ben Roethlisberger, famous Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback.
Okay, so Vera had a tough life. Vera was mentally challenged. She had taken special classes in school, but she graduated in 2005. Intellectually, it was said that Vera was between 8 and 12 years old. She had never had a job, but she received a disability payment every month. At the age of 11, she was raped by her own father, Willard, who was sentenced to prison for this, of course. Vera's family said she loved old country music and she loved to sing. Well, when she was 19, she began dating a 13-year-old boy named Zachary Brooks. And, of course, he was 6 years younger, but like we said, intellectually, she was between 8 and 12 years old.
Yeah.
After dating for a while, Vera became pregnant and gave birth to their baby girl, Willadine. And that was in November of 2009. Willadine was only 17 months old when her mother was murdered. In 2009, a few years before Vera's death, her mother and stepfather had moved away, so Vera moved in with Zachary Brooks and the Brooks family. The family home was at 300 Center Street in Findlay, Ohio. This was the home of Kevin Brooks Sr. and Sherry Brooks, and that's Zachary's parents. And along with their children and some other people, it was reported that at any given time, about 10 people lived in this home. I want to talk first about Sherry Brooks, the matriarch of the family. Sherry had been sexually abused as a child by her father. Sherry ended up having a total of 9 children. Sherry's first set of kids were taken away, but it was all at different times. She had 3 boys and 2 girls. Most of them lived with her for a little bit, and then they were taken away. But one baby girl, little Sherry, was taken from her at birth. And the reason they were taken is there were allegations of her sexually abusing these children. One member of the family even said they walked in on Sherry with one of her infant baby boys holding him up, and she had his penis in her mouth.
I already don't like where this case is going.
One of her baby girls, Marie, was taken away when she was 1 year old and had some vaginal bleeding. At least one of these first 5 kids was fathered with Sherry's own first cousin. We'll get into a little bit more of that later. So all the first 5 kids are taken away. Well, Sherry ends up marrying Kevin Brooks Sr., and they had 4 more kids. Kevin, Garth, Chucky, and Zachary.
So Garth Brooks.
Yes, not the singer.
Right.
So Zachary was the youngest of this set of kids, and Kevin was the oldest, and he was also called Punky. And Kevin, or Punky, was the leader of the city's Crips gang. And in fact, all of the sons were involved in this gang. And Sherry even considered herself a member of the gang. The family and their gang involvement was known to include assaults, burglary, and some drugs.
A police dispatcher in a documentary referred to them as frequent flyers.
Yeah, which means that the police were used to dealing with them a good bit.
During the 2 years prior to Vera's death, police and Child Protective Services visited the home on at least 10 different occasions on a bevy of different calls. Harassment calls, threats, child abuse and neglect calls, fighting, and just general poor living conditions. It was reported that the house was filthy and smelled horrific. They actually had a pig that was living in the house, and not one of these cute little pigs, like 100-pound pig living in their home. They kept it in the closet and kind of like kept it corralled in the closet with a 2-foot piece of plywood. The pig was defecating in the closet, and the CPS people reported that they saw roaches.
So not a good environment.
No.
Well, on January 21st of 2011, before Vera was murdered, a call came into the police that Vera was being held at that home against her will. They said she was not allowed out of the house and was not allowed to even be involved with her own baby, Willadine. And they also said that Sherry was keeping Vera's checks. You know, she got the disability check. Well, officers go to investigate, and they reported that Vera's face was bruised and cut, and it appeared she had a broken nose. Vera told them that an ex-boyfriend from Lima, Ohio had done it to her a while ago. Well, they wound up taking her to the hospital, but she couldn't provide details of the crime, and she basically refused to prosecute. Now, there are some stories I read, I don't know the accuracy of this, so take it for what it's worth, that said the police never questioned her away from Sherry. And I do know in one police report, they said when they went to ask Vera questions, she looked at Sherry for approval to speak to the police.
So Vera was questioned about living in the Brooks home, and she told police that she liked it and she was happy there. The police officers on scene told her that they could help her, but Vera said she was fine and didn't need help. 3 days later, police returned with Child Protective Services. They had noticed that the home was filthy and smelled bad, like I had said before. They asked Vera at that time if she thought that the environment was safe for the baby, and she said it was. Again, we're talking about the mind of an 8-year-old, essentially the mental capacity of an 8-year-old girl is what several people have described Vera as having. It was determined, though, that Vera was an adult, and since there was no court paperwork to say otherwise, that she was essentially capable of making her own decisions. I mean, this is a normal thing. If there's no power of attorney over a person or any court documentation giving someone else charge of that person, then they are considered, if they're over 18, they're considered capable of making their own decisions legally. So in the absence of any documentation that said otherwise, the officers essentially have to let Vera decide for herself if she is in a good situation. And that's kind of a fine line for police. I mean, sometimes you have mental health issues that are undiagnosed or whatever that make it kind of a tough thing. But in this situation, the police did all that they could do. She didn't want to leave, and in the eyes of the law, she was capable of making that decision for herself.
I also found where they said that Sherry was somehow a guardian and the payee of Vera's checks. So I'm guessing she was kind of like the overseer to make sure that Vera got her checks every month and used that money wisely.
I wonder if she was just like on the bank account or something.
I don't know. I could not find anything further than that. I saw that in several sources, but it didn't go too far into it. Sherry's own family and other friends and people in the community said Sherry was obsessed with having a baby girl. And this started after her children were taken away. She was just obsessed with baby girls. And Sherry encouraged this relationship between Vera and her son Zachary, and she encouraged them to have a baby. And Sherry, in fact, did this with all of her sons and their girlfriends or their wives. She encouraged them to have babies as soon as they could. So once Vera became pregnant and they found out it was a girl, Sherry said it was her baby and would tell other people that, hey, that's my baby in there. She even had Zachary agree that if it was a baby girl, that he would give her the rights to that child. So Vera was due in early December of 2009 with her baby girl, but on November 3rd, which was Sherry's birthday, she forced Vera to drink 3 bottles of castor oil. And this is kind of an old wives' tale or a home remedy to induce labor, but if you look online and you research this, the recommended dosage is 2 tablespoons. But she had her drink 3 bottles.
This Sherry has issues.
Yeah, now I think as we go along further, you're going to see that that's a very accurate statement. So she drank the castor oil, and it did put Vera into labor, but the baby wasn't born on Sherry's birthday. It was born the next day on November 4th, a whole month early. Willa Dean spent the first few weeks in the NICU, and Vera had to get permission from Sherry to even go see her own baby. Once Willa Dean was brought home, the baby even slept in Sherry's room, and Sherry was telling everyone it was her baby.
And this is after she's already had at least 5 kids taken away from her by Child Protective Services?
Yes, she had the first 5 taken away.
Oof.
So Sherry was telling everybody it was her child, and she would not allow Vera to even interact with Willa Dean without permission. And the permission had to come from Sherry. And Sherry's even the one who gave Willa Dean her name.
So shortly after the birth of Willa Dean, things kind of start to go south for the family, okay? And it all centered around Sherry's oldest son, Kevin, that everybody called Punky. He was the leader of the local Crip gang. And everyone in the family said that Punky basically ran the household. Sherry is this real domineering figure that seems to be in control of everyone except for Punky. Punky was like the undisputed man of the house. Even Sherry, basically took orders from him. And on August 5th, 2010, he and his girlfriend are walking down this road there in Findlay, and the family claims that he and the girlfriend were going to see a fireworks show or something like that, but the general consensus amongst everyone else is that they were looking to score drugs, or in particular heroin. And while they're walking, a taxi cab is driving down the road, and I guess saw them at the last second and tried to swerve, but he lost control of the taxi cab and struck Punky, killing him. All right. Heather wasn't struck by the taxi cab, just Punky, and it killed him. Now, the police investigated the accident, and they concluded that that's exactly how it happened. It was just an accident, that Punky was struck and killed. Sherry never really was able to accept that. He was such a strong figure in the household, she just never could accept that. And she even went so far as to accuse the girlfriend, Heather, of pushing Punky in front of the taxi. She was so convinced that Heather was responsible that she even recruited one of Punky's friends, Marcy, to severely beat Heather while she watched.
So I think this is where the biggest, like you said, everything started going south from here. And there were some incidents that happened in the home after Punky died, and I want to cover those. First of all, Vera was helping Sherry clean the rabbit cages outside, which it was strange to me. The pig was kept inside, but the rabbits were kept outside. Anyway, Vera was helping Sherry to clean these rabbit cages, and Sherry started yelling for help. She said that Vera had purposely dropped bricks on Sherry's foot, and Vera claimed it was an accident because these bricks were holding the tarp, and when they went to move the tarp, the bricks fell on her. But Sherry said no, she did it on purpose. And Sherry even says now she has permanent injury on her foot because of this, and Vera never even apologized. Well, because of this, Vera was severely beaten and had to be hospitalized. Remember back in January when the police came? That was because of this incident. So Sherry had to keep her feet in wraps because of this, because of the injury. And Sherry is now in a wheelchair, and partly to blame for this incident. Another incident that happened involved Punky's ashes, which Sherry kept in the home. And she kind of had like a small shrine set up with his ashes sitting there. And they had left a candy bar near the ashes for Punky. Well, Vera was hungry and she ate the candy bar. Again, she was beaten. And not only beaten by her boyfriend Zachary, but he called some of Punky's ex-girlfriends to come over and beat her too.
I don't understand this let's just call our friends to beat each other up. I don't know. It's strange.
Sherry continually had her sons, their friends, girlfriends to abuse, physically and mentally abuse Vera. And Sherry would blame everything and anything on Vera. Everything that happened in the house, oh, it was Vera. It was Vera. And she did this in order to incite her boys and the girlfriends and friends to keep abusing Vera. They said that Sherry had basically turned Vera into a slave. Vera had a job in the house, and her job was to rub Sherry's feet. They said when she didn't do it right, Sherry kept a big stick beside her and would hit Vera with the stick. At one point, Vera was forced to sleep in the closet with the pig, feces, and all. Vera wasn't allowed to leave her room unless she was called by Sherry. Like we said earlier, Zachary repeatedly abused Vera, but the abuse just got increasingly worse over time, especially after Punky's death. And a lot of it was Sherry telling her son to beat Vera. So right before Vera was murdered on March 3rd of 2011, a guy named Danny Bixler, who is a cousin of the Brooks family, was released from prison. Now, Danny had been in prison since 2008 for burglary, theft, and receiving stolen property. Danny was 20 years old at the time, and Danny lived in Tiffin, Ohio, which is about 25 miles from Findlay. Well, he gets out. He starts dating this 17-year-old girl named Nicole Peters. It wasn't long after his prison release that Danny and Nicole assaulted a teenager in a park in Tiffin. Because of this, and Danny being on parole, they fled to the Brooks home to avoid the prosecution. And they arrived at the Brooks home on Sunday, March 20th. Now, he got out on March 3rd, and they arrived at the home March 20th, 2011.
Because he's picked up some type of assault charge because someone insulted his new girlfriend or made a pass at his new girlfriend.
No, actually, that's not what it was. They were at the park, and somebody wouldn't give up a swing for his new girlfriend, Nicole, to use the swing.
Nice.
Well, here's the interesting thing about Danny. You know, I told you earlier that Sherry's oldest child was with her first cousin. That first cousin is also Danny's father. So Sherry's oldest son, Scotty, who she lost custody of, but somehow these kids, even though she lost custody, wound up coming back to the home. So her oldest son, Scotty, his father is Danny Sr., and Danny Bixler is actually a junior. So they have the same daddy. They're cousins and half
brothers.
Yes. Okay. At this point, Danny and Nicole are staying at the Brooks home, and Sherry began to involve the two of them on the beatings of Vera. Sherry told Danny that it was Vera who pushed Punky in front of the taxi. Well, Danny was also a member of this gang, and that hit him hard. And he was in prison, so he didn't know better of what actually happened. He took Sherry's word for it. So now she's blaming it on Vera, and Vera wasn't even with them. She also told Danny of the other things Vera had done, like with the bricks on her foot and eating Punky's candy bar they had left by his ashes. And she wound up telling Nicole that Vera had slept with all of her sons and would try to sleep with Danny too. So Sherry is obviously trying to incite them into these beatings. The beatings began to get really severe, and this was from Danny, Nicole, and the other family members. And at one point, Chucky, who was one of the sons that lived in the home, forced Vera to eat dog feces.
It was like this whole family just took turns abusing this girl.
That's exactly what happened. Danny and Nicole would beat Vera, and then they would go have sex and come back and beat her again.
Almost like they were aroused by it.
Yeah, exactly. They would use their fists, they would use their feet, they had a paddle that they would use, and Chucky had made this device. He took a belt and he locked the padlock on the end of the belt, and they would all take turns using it to beat Vera. So who knows if Willadine actually saw these beatings or what that child knew. Luckily she was young enough that won't be a memory.
Yeah. You have to assume that Sherry, in a lot of ways, was getting off on watching the beatings happen.
Oh, yeah, and she would encourage it. She'd say, hit her again, hit her harder. And Sherry at one point said Vera looked cute with her black eyes. She looked like a little squirrel. Now I want to cover the night of the murder. At about 9 or 9:15-ish, Zachary told Vera to put her shoes on and go with Danny and Nicole. And at first, Vera was like, no, I don't want to leave. I want to stay here. And he threatened her, and she did what he said because she knew it would cause another beating. So they walked Vera to the train tracks, and it was a little confusing because some reports said that Danny, Nicole, Vera, and Zachary went to the train tracks. Other reports said it was Danny, Nicole, and Vera. I'm going to kind of get into the evidence that was shown in a minute, but either the 3 or 4 of them walked to train tracks that were near the home, and they had taken a knife from the kitchen block. They began to stab Vera at these train tracks. And at one point, they got her to take off her clothes and her shoes, and they stabbed her a total of 21 times and eventually slit her throat ear to ear. The reason they had her take off her clothes was because the kitchen knife was dull, and they said it wouldn't penetrate her clothes well. So they had her get undressed in order for them to be able to kill her.
After they'd already started stabbing her.
After they started stabbing her, yes. It was also reported almost all of the bones in her face were broken for these beatings that had been going on for the last few days. The cause of death was multiple trauma. She had numerous blunt and sharp trauma injuries to her torso, head, and legs. So she was naked, she was stabbed, and then she was left in these cold temperatures, laid across the train tracks, like perpendicular, so that the train would run over her, and they were hoping it would destroy evidence of their crime. Mm-hmm. When the train comes through, they call the police department, and this was about 2 a.m. when the train came through and saw her on the tracks, and her property was left in the area, and they were able to confirm that it was Vera, so they called Sherry to come ID her body.
They didn't even call her parents. So after they leave Vera, Danny, Nicole, and Zachary go back to the Brooks home, and they're celebrating and high-fiving, and they're just having a great time. And Nicole even makes the comment that she earned her first teardrop, referring to like a teardrop tattoo that people get in prison when they've killed someone, supposedly. Danny already had a teardrop tattoo. And so they're all partying, and one of the people at the party with them is Danny's sister, Desta. And Desta's kind of an outlier to the story to this point. She is just Danny's sister, but she notices that Zachary's upset. And when she pressed him about what was wrong, and he was kind of evasive, but he just wasn't acting normal. They said he kept kind of pounding his head into the wall and that kind of thing. And at one point, Danny tells Desta what they've done. She kind of thought they were just kidding around or bluffing or whatever, and they went to a convenience store to get some cigarettes, and she observed the train stopped on the tracks. And she asked the clerk why the train was stopped on the tracks, and the clerk said, well, they found a body there. And at that point, Desta realized that Danny had told her the truth, or when he said that they had killed Vera, and that's when Desta went to the police.
So after Desta goes to the police, they pick Danny and Nicole up, and eventually Danny and Nicole start to talk. And here's what they had to say. They said when they arrived at the Brooks home, the family began to tell them of all that Vera had done. Sherry told them that it was Vera who pushed Punky in front of the taxi. They both say that they were fueled by drugs and alcohol, and that they did beat Vera. It was Sherry's idea for Vera to be murdered, and they discussed how and where to do it. And Sherry told them to put her on the tracks because the train would run over her and turn her into hamburger meat. Those were her exact words. And she said she knew this because a few years earlier, her nephew had been hit by a train, and it turned him into hamburger meat. On the day of the murder, Sherry's daughter-in-law, Shannon, and her husband, Michael, were living in the home, and Shannon was reportedly 3 months pregnant. Well, Vera set off a canister of mace inside the home, and this happened around 5:15 p.m. Well, Shannon got upset and said, she better not have caused me to miscarry, and was carrying on. And Shannon went to the hospital, and they were able to confirm that she arrived at the hospital about 5:30. When she returned home, she told the family that she had in fact miscarried, and Vera had caused it. And this was the final straw, Danny and Nicole had said. Well, they lead Vera out of the house about 9 or so, and they walked to the tracks. They said they began stabbing her. The knife was dull. They made her take her clothes off so that they could stab her better. And they just kind of threw her clothes and belongings around. And finally, Danny stepped behind her and slit her throat. And they put her perpendicular across the tracks again because they thought it was going to destroy the evidence or any crime that they had done. So Danny, Nicole, Sherry, Zachary, Shannon, Michael, and Chucky all planned the murder, according to Danny and Nicole. After Danny and Nicole were picked up and they began to confess, the police go to the Brooks home. They question Sherry, and here's what she tells them at first. Well, Vera left. She said Vera left with her boyfriend named Larry Spencer around 9 p.m. Now, Larry was this older man, and he was homeless and lived in the area, and he had been to the Brooks home a few times. He was in no way Vera's boyfriend. They kind of pulled that apart. So then she said, well, she saw Vera in the kitchen with Danny and Nicole around 8:30 or so, and then they all went for a walk. And she said when Danny and Nicole came back without Vera, Sherry asked her about it, and they said, oh, don't worry, she's just with her boyfriend or a male friend, something to that effect. Well, Kevin Sr., he doesn't say much because by all accounts, Kevin Sr. was just a coward, and he wouldn't even stand up to Sherry himself. Well, in the home, here's what they found. They found Nicole's sweatshirt, which had blood on it. They found the paddle that Danny and Nicole talked about. They found the belt with the padlock. And Danny told them that he had thrown the knife in the nearby river and told them, kind of where it was. And they were actually able to retrieve this knife. Other family members in the house, here's some things that they had to say. Scotty, the oldest, that's also Danny's half-brother, said that his mother Sherry had sexually abused him when he was young, and he compared his mother to Charles Manson. He said it was a cult-like atmosphere. Shannon, the one that was supposedly pregnant and lost the baby, said she was never pregnant and didn't tell anybody that. It was just a story that Sherry came up with. But in fact, they were able to prove that Shannon had actually posted on social media that she was pregnant. They're not exactly getting the truth from anybody, I don't think. Well, all the family starts talking, and the sons start turning on their mom, and they say that she would lie to get people to do what she wanted. She treated Vera like a slave. They said Zachary would beat her, and they had all openly discussed killing Vera since the brick on Sherry's foot incident. Zachary and Sherry talked about drugging Vera and putting her on the railroad tracks at one point. Sherry basically wanted this baby for herself, and Zachary didn't really want to be with Vera anymore, but Sherry wouldn't let her leave because she didn't want Vera to leave and take the baby, and also she didn't want to be without Vera's disability check. Well, they decided eventually it was time to get rid of Vera so Sherry could keep Willadine, and Danny and Nicole were the people to do it. Well, come to find out, Danny had actually stabbed Vera the day before the murder in the thigh. And Sherry says she was able to stick her finger in the wound to see how deep it was. But nobody has called the police. Nobody has called 911. Sherry said, I can't get up, I can't walk around, and nobody would hand me the phone. Shannon said, well, I was out of minutes, and I know I can call 911 without minutes, but... And that's really what she says, is but. They also reported that Vera had been sodomized with a toilet plunger. They also said she was menstruating, so they sexually assaulted her with a toothbrush and then made her use the toothbrush.
So this is the family members telling the police this?
Yes, yes. They said the mace incident was a complete setup to give a reason for the murder. Vera did not set off mace in the house. They also said that Sherry purposely kept Vera away from her own family so that she couldn't tell what was going on, or so her family couldn't encourage her to leave the situation.
Right.
Well, across the street from the home, there was a surveillance camera of sorts. And what that camera showed was Danny, Nicole, and Vera leave the home walking in a single file line.
So it doesn't show Zach.
It doesn't show Zachary walking with them. Sherry's family says Sherry is a compulsive liar. They said she lives in a fantasy world. She believes her own lies. And she doesn't really want kids. She just wants a baby, and particularly a girl baby. because she had this abnormal fixation with baby girls. Sherry herself was actually put into foster care at the age of 3, and she returned home to her mother at the age of 16, and she told her mother that while she was in foster care, she had had a baby, and that the foster family kept the baby. Well, Vera's mother said, "Hey, that's your baby, we're going to go get it." Well, when her mother starts looking into this, she discovers that it wasn't actually Sherry's baby, it was just another foster child that the family was caring for.
So this woman had an obsession with babies from a very early age.
Yes, she did. And an obsession with lying about things that and believing them. Her mom even said, and we're going to tell you about the documentary at the end of this, but in the documentary we watched, her mom said that they were really proud of her when she had Marie, because she actually kept Marie for a whole year.
That's outstanding.
Sherry told the police that Vera wouldn't touch Willadine or wouldn't allow Willadine to even come near her, and she wouldn't love and hug on her, and that's why Sherry was kind of caring for her. When in actuality what it was is when Willadine would come near Vera, she would say, "No, no, don't," or, "I'm going to get in trouble." And they even had Willadine, they were teaching her to call Sherry Mommy and not Vera. So here is kind of where Vera gets her peace. In the final moments of her life, after they've stabbed her, they've slit her throat, she's naked, laying in the cold. She moves herself from laying across the tracks and curls up in between the rails, so that the train, when it does run over, of course, it can still damage her, but she's not laying across the tracks. But when the train comes through, the height of Vera's body laying between them was 12 inches. The clearance that the train had was 13 inches. So the train missed her by 1 inch.
Wow. So the train just went over the top of her but didn't actually strike her or anything.
Yes, and that preserved the evidence that Nicole and Danny were hoping that it would get
destroyed,
rid of.
right.
Yeah. The day after the murder, Sherry called to have full custody of Willadine given to Zachary.
I mean, before Vera's even buried or anything. That obviously points to her involvement.
Yeah, and to her motive too. Well, so the murder happened March 26th. On March 28th, Willadine was taken from the home. And I'm happy to see that Willadine has since been adopted outside the family.
Yeah, no one in this story, absolutely no one, needs to have a kid. So the police have sifted through this lie after lie and story after story from all the family. They start to piece everything together, and they make arrests. And both Danny Bixler and Nicole Peters are charged with the murder of Vera, and Danny receives life with eligibility for parole after 40 years. Nicole Peters, who was 17 at the time of Vera's murder, was tried as an adult and receives 23 years. Now, they were the only two that were charged with Vera's actual murder. But Zachary also received 4 years for obstruction with intent to mislead and threatening witnesses. Sherry, who gave some false statements to the police, was given 30 days, but that was basically suspended due to her medical condition. She was released. So she lied to police initially and gave misleading statements and was given a 30-day sentence, but didn't have to serve it because of her medical conditions. But that, as you might have guessed, that is not the end of their legal troubles. In 2014, Sherry spent 10 days in jail for inappropriate contact with an unrelated minor. I don't know what kind of inappropriate contact you could have with an unrelated minor that would only get you 10 days. In 2015, Sherry is sentenced to 40 months for drug trafficking. And Kevin Sr., he didn't play a huge role in this story. He just kind of sat by and watched it happen. The whole family referred to him as a coward, but he's eventually charged with selling prescription drugs with his son.
The reasons for the murder kind of all come back to Sherry and Sherry wanting Vera gone. They point to the miscarriage of Shannon, which actually did not happen. They point to Punky's death, which Vera was obviously not responsible for. They point to injuring Sherry's foot, which could have been an accident, could have not been an accident. But the big thing overall is basically wanting Willadine to herself.
And so it sounds like Sherry basically just provided the fuel for the fire. I mean, she basically blamed whatever she could on Vera to get all these people around to take it out on her. And they believed what Sherry said. Sherry's obviously very manipulative.
Obviously, yes.
After her death, Vera's mom and stepdad make the funeral arrangements. And in the obituary, they had her name as Vera Jo Messersmith, which is her stepfather's last name. And they did this because Reigel, the last name that we have referred to her as, is her father's last name. But her mom did not want her to have the same last name as the father who reportedly raped her. But this, for some reason, was a major issue with the Brooks, and so Vera's parents and the Brooks feuded over whether or not the obituary should say Vera Jo Messersmith or Vera Jo Reigel. It just seems like they argued about everything.
Yeah, and this family who was all involved in her murder is arguing about what her last name should be.
So her mother was also upset that Sherry had been the one to identify Vera's body. And we mentioned this earlier, but there's a little bit of backstory or reason why that happened. Initially, when the police go to Sherry's home to ask her about Vera, and they have found Vera's body on the tracks and everything, Sherry tells the police that Vera's parents are deceased, and that's why they allowed Sherry to identify her body. Sherry also told them that Vera had lived with her on and off for the last 5 years and had dated her son and that they had a child together. So the police are trying to locate a next of kin, someone who can positively identify Vera's body, and Sherry tells the police, hey, look, her parents are deceased. We are the closest thing to next of kin that she's got. So the police allow her to identify Vera's remains, and that was obviously very upsetting to Vera's mother, who is not deceased, but in fact alive.
Well, Vera's mother did admit that she had not actually seen her daughter Vera since 2009, but they occasionally talked by phone, which it wasn't very often because, again, Sherry was trying to keep Vera away from her family. And the Brooks family would tell Vera that her mother didn't want her and her mother didn't love her and didn't want her around. And she would do this so that Vera wouldn't want to contact her family also. Vera is buried at Knollcrest Gardens in Acadia, Ohio, and her last name on her headstone does show Messersmith. And one of the final things I want to tell you about this story, and the prosecutor read it at the trial of Danny and Nicole, and it was a letter that they found in Vera's purse. And it was obviously a letter Vera had written to her daughter. It said, I love you, Willadine. You are a good little baby girl to us. I am glad to be your mommy, and I'm glad that I had you on November 4th at 4:16 a.m., 6 pounds, 2 ounces, 19 inches long. Mommy loves you.
It's just a sad story that this poor girl was abused and everything else, and all these people are manipulated by Sherry, and at the center of all of it is this baby Willadine and her mom, who were both innocent parties. It's just a really sad story.
It is, and you see a lot online, and if you go on Facebook, there's a lot of different pages for justice for Vera Jo and support for her, because people were upset that Sherry and all the other sons, they weren't charged in her murder. But it's like any other case. If you don't have enough to put forward to say they are directly responsible for the murder, you're not going to get a conviction at trial.
That's right. It's been said a lot, and it's true. It's not about what you know. It's about what you can prove. And I think anyone can see that the family's involvement outside of just Danny and Nicole, the family played a much larger role in Vera's death and probably involved in the premeditation of her death. but there just hasn't been enough evidence to support any charges like that against the family. If you liked this podcast and want a little more information about it, we did refer to a documentary, and we watched a documentary on Amazon Prime called Goodnight Sugar Babe that has a lot of additional information. You might want to check it out. It was a real good source of information for us for this one.
Yeah, I mean, we use that along with some of the other research. One final note on that, Goodnight Sugar Babe, the title of this documentary, actually refers to Sherry, because Sherry was given the nickname Sugar Babe as a child. And Sherry says in the documentary that's the last thing Vera said to her was "Goodnight, Sugar Babe." Normally, I don't like documentaries as a single source, and I didn't use it as a single source, but this one was fairly accurate with all the other information I could find. So I do recommend you watch it.
It's definitely worth your time to watch it if you are intrigued by this story as we were, because you get to put a face to all these names, and let me tell you, it is definitely worth the watch. And that's it for this week. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week. Visit our website at truecrimeoutloud.com, on Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one. Or on Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this podcast can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.